This is from the head of the FDA at the time. And he's talking about polio vaccine. Any possible doubts, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist.
Yes. I remember reading that, Doc. Can you
repeat
that one more time?
I will. This is staggering, because this is what you and I have been up against all these years. This mentality. Any possible doubts, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist in view of the need to assure that the vaccine will continue to be used to the maximum extent consistent with the nation's public health objectives. In other words, it doesn't matter how serious the adverse reaction is, how many children it affects or kills, it doesn't matter.
Guys, what a powerful episode we had with Dr. Wakefield. He's such a humble guy, down to earth. Really, really just love Dr. Wakefield. And if you don't know him, he was a guy that really stood in the gap. So I'm just very thankful to Dr. Wakefield and his generosity with his time. One question I wanted to ask him, and I wish I would have, and I'm going to have to ask him in the email, is his take on viruses. Does he believe in the old tongue with viruses? Is it just a toxin and a poison, or is it some boogie virus? But it sounds like he does believe in the boogie virus outside of there. But Dr. Wakefield is a very, 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 very brilliant-minded doctor. So I really love him to death. But I just want to put a plug out there and thank you for all that are supporting this podcast. This podcast is exploding. And we just want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Ezra Healing. If you don't know about them, the owner of Ezra Healing stood in the gap during COVID. She was fired for refusing a vaccine at the hospital. Can you imagine? So she lost her job and she basically said, okay, screw you guys. I'm going to do my own thing. And she started Ezra Healing. So she is making headway. She's making waves in the world right now. In fact, the government just came after her 2 months ago and confiscated $200,000 worth of ivermectin. So if you don't know Ezra Healing, go to their site, EzraHealing.com. Go support them. We just want to give a shout out to them. I also want to just put a plug in for our locals page. We're trying to grow this podcast even more. So go to drbentapper.locals.com. Support the show. Give a shout out to this podcast. Share this podcast with a friend. We need all the help we can get. We were just banned in Australia. Literally, they banned our podcast. So we are experiencing censorship. We're experiencing this to this day. They do not want the truth out there. Just like George Martin stated that, when you cut out a man's tongue, you don't prove him a liar. You are fearful of what he has to say. What are they so afraid of? That we're just a little chiropractor here in Blair, Nebraska, but they're afraid of what we have to say. They're afraid of the truth, but they cannot suppress us. We know that God is on our side, and if he is for us, who could ever be against us? Anyway, guys, go to our locals page, support this podcast, drbentapper.locals.com. You can subscribe to this podcast for like $7 or $8. You can get all the exclusive. We're going to put some goodies in there. So please support this podcast, guys. It helps me keep this podcast going. It helps put food on the table. God bless you guys. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you. To August of last year, nobody really knew who I was.
There's about 12 people who are producing 65% of anti-vaccine misinformation.
We need to come together as Americans and realize that we have a war at hand here. Right?
Like, dude, how scared of this shit do you have to be to be wearing gloves, a face shield, a mask at this point?
Help us to urge folks and say to them, look, it's time to roll up your sleeve and get the shot.
Chiropractor in Omaha, Nebraska, responsible for 65% of the anti-vaccine misinformation. Put what I say to the test. Just don't write me off as crazy misinformation.
Doctor, please bring your cell phone. 600,000 people will die of cancer. 300,000 people will die of obesity this year. When is enough enough?
Dr. Wakefield?
Hello there. Yes, I had a little trouble getting on, but here we are.
Yes. Oh, my goodness. It's so good to see you, my friend.
Pleasure. Great to be here.
We got so much to talk about and unfold here. I'm so thankful that you've been generous with your time. I think this is our third or fourth interview that we've done over the years. So I'm always just so excited and tickled pink that we get to sit down and talk. How you been, my friend?
I have been remarkably well. Yeah.
Yeah, especially with all the hot topics in the news lately, you got to be feeling vindication, Doc.
Well, certainly the world has changed. It's not the world we imagined it would be even just a year ago. So I'm reassured, I have to say.
Yeah. So tell me, let's just unfold some of these topics. I mean, you were the OG in this fight, and you've been, censored, like myself. I mean, I have kind of, I've definitely experienced a lot of that with the disinformation dozen list, which I feel like you were the OG in that list, the truth teller that's been, in the fight, in the trenches for a long time. The topic that I want to kind of discuss with you is obviously the MMR. I want to talk about the measles scare and all this nonsense that's being pushed on the people, and what we're seeing here, is I feel like this tsunami of propaganda that's coming our way now because the tides are turning, like you said. It's a different time that we're in. So many people are waking up to the vaccine issues, and I feel like the soil is rich right now for the truth, and people are asking the right kind of questions. I mean, but what I'm seeing right now, especially in alternative, they keep feeding the masses that still believe in the vaccines this propaganda, and I'm sure you are seeing that the measles outbreak, and I want to just kind of walk through this whole measles as portrayed as this deadly disease, but really it's not. It's a benign, in 99% of the cases is benign issue. It's a benign issue, and there's nothing to fear here. And arguably the MMR is going to have more consequences and reactions and harmful than the disease itself. Walk us through.
Yes, I mean it's a fascinating topic, and it goes back a long way. I think that certain things that need to be talked about when you see a measles outbreak described in the media and the sensation that goes with it, the sensationalism. It's important to remember this: that remember the outbreak at Disneyland or Disney World in California all those years ago, and at that time they did a survey of the cases in America, and they actually analyzed the samples to look at the strain. What was the strain of the virus that was causing this? And in 43% of cases, it was vaccine strain measles. In other words, 43% of the cases of measles in this country were being caused by the vaccine itself. Now, we were not told that at the time. In fact, we weren't told that. I wasn't aware of it, and I look out for these things for 4 years. That information was withheld from the public. That's essential information because you will never eradicate a disease or indeed get it under the kind of control that you would like if the vaccine, what you're giving to prevent it, is actually causing it. So it's extremely dishonest when they put this information out there to withhold the fact to parents, to the public, that nearly half of the cases are actually caused by the vaccine virus itself.
Right.
Now, in terms of the label of a deadly disease, it's essential to understand measles and to look at what happened over time. And I'm sure you've seen this many times, Ben, but this is a graph that looks at mortality. And I hope your viewers can see this, and I can certainly send it to you. Can you see that graph, Ben?
Yep. If you raise it up just a little bit.
There you
go. A little bit more.
A little bit more.
There you go. Perfect.
Now, this graph is very, very telling. It looks at measles mortality, death rates from measles in children under 16 over the last 100 and odd years. And up until 1920, measles was a major killer of children during epidemics, 1,200 per million dying during epidemics. It then fell precipitously. It fell extraordinarily to almost zero. And the vaccine was introduced after that fall had taken place. Now, measles mortality, is a measure of the seriousness of the disease. In other words, measles, over a very short time period, was becoming a dramatically less severe disease, a milder and milder condition. What would have happened if we'd done nothing, if we'd not intervened with the vaccine, we just left that graph to take its own natural course? It would have disappeared to approach zero.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, mortality from measles would have gone. As you pointed out, it's a mild disease, and it was becoming milder and milder very, very quickly. And when the 1964 meeting at the National Institutes of Health was held to determine whether there should be universal measles vaccination or not, and an expert was brought over from the UK, the world's expert on infectious diseases, and he said effectively, no, don't do it. Don't do it. It's a mild disease of childhood. It's transient. It's not a major problem. Perhaps one child per 100,000 dies, perhaps as low as 1 in a million in Scandinavian countries. And isn't it more important to ask what is different about the child who dies than to entertain the idea of giving this preventative, this so-called preventative, in the entire population? Because if you change the ecology of measles and man in by doing that, if you change the outcome, if you alter, for example, the age of exposure, and this is really important, by giving universal measles vaccine, if it doesn't, for example, give you lifelong immunity, you become susceptible again later in life, and therefore when measles comes back, it's the older people who get it. Well, measles is more dangerous in the very young and the old. Now, we're very familiar with this now after COVID. It was an interesting idea, but were not really entertained many years ago, except by the experts. But now everybody knows that age of exposure to COVID is an important factor. The older you are, the greater the risk of a severe outcome. So is this true of measles? The answer is absolutely yes. And if you're giving a vaccine that alters that age of exposure, age of susceptibility, then you're going to produce problems. So the answer was, from the experts, don't do this unless you can guarantee that it will produce immunity like natural infection, that is lifelong immunity. Don't do it. And they went ahead and did it anyway.
I have a lot of questions around this topic, just even the topic of measles, because, I've talked to some doctors and I've had some conversations around even like, would you agree that there's obviously just a lot of propaganda around this whole disease? And I'm talking with the diagnostics of measles. I mean, even I would say a lot of the majority of cases right now, I'm seeing that, get tested for the measles, without even having any objective findings to a rash or, when people think of measles, they think, the spots on the body, and they're doing this testing and they're diagnosing these kids with measles without any objective spots of a rash or anything that would indicate measles. They might have a fever, or they might have a, maybe like the flu, but they're using this PCR testing to diagnose. And what are your thoughts on this? And I feel like the PCR test, I'm just going to be very blunt. I feel like there's a ton of corruption around that testing, with this, because how many times I had people during COVID, they would test positive for COVID, but they had zero symptomatology to correspond or correlate to that diagnosis. There was no objective findings or subjective findings even to correlate. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, firstly, a study was done on this years ago. I don't remember the numbers, but they presented clinicians with cases of measles and non-measles, and they got it wrong in the great majority of cases. They could not distinguish. Why? Because they had no familiarity with clinical measles. So measles was getting overdiagnosed in some places and underdiagnosed in others. So relying on clinical criteria alone in an age when we are not experienced at diagnosing measles clinically is fraught with hazard. Moreover, with PCR should not be used as a diagnostic test.
We'll be right back after a word for our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Ezra Healing, a leader in the emerging wellness paradigm taking shape across North America and beyond. People everywhere are recognizing that the old sick care model, quick fixes, symptom chasing, and surface level solutions simply isn't enough. Ezra Healing is a part of the shift toward truly patient-centered care that prioritizes well-being, integrity, and a do-no-harm approach. At Ezra Healing, your whole lifestyle, rhythms, and patterns are considered to better support support the interconnected systems of your body. They're focused on real solutions, long-term health promotion, and prevention, an evolving grassroots movement dedicated to helping individuals and families live healthier and more resilient lives. If you're ready for a wellness experience that puts humanity first, Ezra Healing is guiding the way. To learn more, visit them at www.ezrahealing.com. And now back to the show.
It shouldn't, isn't it? It's an experimental model. It's a fascinating technology, but even Terry Mullis, the inventor of PCR, said, it shouldn't be used for this indication because it is so prone to false positive results. It amplifies to the point where garbage gets turned into the sequence of interest. It should not be used in this indication, particularly the more cycles you use, the more logarithmic amplification you get of copy numbers of the virus, and the more likely you are to produce a false positive error. So it shouldn't be used, and therefore I agree with you entirely. Take it out of the arena.
It's interesting that Terry Mullis died in 2019. You find that interesting timing?
Yes, no, it was convenient. I don't know. I don't know. He was what he died of. I'm not sure of the history of that, but he certainly went up against the system. It's not a good insurance policy.
That's right. I mean, he spoke out against Fauci. He said Fauci had no idea what he was talking about. He just goes up there in front of the microphone and he's just a puppet master.
If only more people had listened to him at the time.
Yeah, right. So it's interesting. I think that, but it's also interesting the cycle rate, like you mentioned, these PCR testing, because they can increase the positive diagnoses by increasing spin cycle rates on these PCR tests. And I think a lot of these diseases that we vaccinate for, or just these so-called scares that we have in the media, are correlated to this PCR test. And I think in order for this fear-mongering campaigns to stop, we really need to have that conversation around the diagnostic tools that are used in the clinical setting. But so Doc, tell me, with measles and your and what you know to be true, and so many people say, well, if you have measles naturally, you said lifelong immunity. I mean, I've heard that measles can prevent cancers and other diseases if you have that natural immunity. Do you know much about that?
Yeah, only to the extent that papers have been published showing, as you say, that natural measles exposure as a child seems to have a protective effect against certain types of cancers, particularly some nervous system cancers later in life. And that's fascinating because it goes to this issue that our early environmental exposures are a major determinant of our long-term health, if you like. So that is very interesting. And we appear to have lost some benefit to natural measles by getting rid of it. When we change the ecosystem, when we change the balance between man and microbe, we do so with huge consequences. And this is seen in that graph that I showed you, that decay is natural herd immunity. You have removed, through vaccination, natural herd immunity completely. Mm-hmm. Now people are not immune in the same way that they were before. And so I'll show you another graph, which is equally fascinating. And this, can you see that, Ben?
Yep. Hold it just like that. Back it up a touch.
Back it up.
Right there. Good.
This is a graph from a blood donation center in Boca Raton. And this is a study that was published some years ago. And I can send you the details of this if you'd like to.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
Available for your listeners. But this looks at the neutralizing antibody levels in the blood of blood donors. Neutralizing antibodies to measles are those that appear to be critical to protect against the measles. They neutralize the measles virus. And what we see over here on this side is blood samples taken from people who had measles infection before the vaccination. And their residual immunity to measles is very high. The broken line here is the introduction of the first vaccine. This other broken line over here is the introduction of the booster vaccine. And you can see that the blood samples show that the neutralizing antibody titers, the levels, have fallen dramatically in people who have not had measles but have had the vaccination and disappear after the booster dose.
So their antibodies disappear to the.
In other words, if we are to believe that neutralizing antibodies are critical to protection against measles, then vaccination appears to have eliminated them. We have a population that is no longer immune. So if measles does come back, what is going to happen? It's going to be very different than what was back in the time that measles was prevalent and people got natural immunity.
Do you think that these vaccinations will lead to another, how do you say it? By that graph, we're eliminating antibodies. And so they're thinking that vaccinations are going to protect them, but according to that graph, antibodies are disappearing due to the vaccinations. And this is kind of like Dr. Sabine Hazar's work, where she found that post-vaccination bifidobacterium was wiped out, one of the main bacterial cultures in the colon. And I believe that 95% of our immune system is in the gut. And this is something that I think more than anybody. The gut is affected by a lot of these vaccinations. And so do you think that these vaccines will actually cause how do you say it, a real epidemic of disease?
I think there is a real danger that will happen, not least of which is because, let's just take antibiotics and bacteria as an example. Antibiotics were introduced sort of 100 years ago, just under 100 years ago, in the form of penicillin. At the time, it was a miracle. There were diseases that we could do nothing about, like neurosyphilis, battlefield gangrene, things like this, rheumatic fever, that were killers. And then antibiotics came along and changed that landscape completely. They were a miracle, but miracles do not stand still in nature. And what happened over time, because of the antibiotics, is there was the emergence of resistant strains. If the antibiotic kills 95% of the bacteria, the 5% that remain and survive then become the dominant species. And they proliferate. So you produce another antibiotic and it gets rid of 95% of that new species. The 5% that remain, once again, become the dominant species until you have a highly resistant, and in this case, highly pathogenic, dangerous bacteria. And that's what's happened. And the public health authorities in the UK described this as the post-antibiotic apocalypse, their words.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that antibiotics were not a miracle at the time, it's just that it does not stand still. Nature will find a way around this. That's what nature does, it evolves. So
you see that in our farm industry too, these crazy herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, all these, and then they get these super weeds.
And then you make things 10 times worse.
Yeah, exactly right.
What we're seeing with particularly the old vaccines, the MMR, the old live viral vaccines now, is the emergence of resistant strains. They're resistant to the immunity induced by the vaccine. And this is particularly in declayed measles virus strains, which are seen predominantly in highly intensively vaccinated countries like France and the UK. So we're witnessing the emergence of resistant strains of measles virus. What happens in a population where you have obliterated natural herd immunity, neutralizing antibody titers have plummeted through the floor, and then a dangerous resistant strain appears on the scene? What happens then? That's
where your epidemic is going to come in. I think it's a scary thought. I mean, just, even the massive rise in chronic disease in our children, look at all the neurological, and I know you know this, Doc, the amount of neurological issues that we have now. In my opinion, this is the epidemic. The amount of garbage that we put in these vaccines, the aluminum toxicity. I mean, I know we had the talk of thimerosal and then acetaminophen, how that strips the body from glutathione, and going to that. I always say the seeds to the farmer to bring a crop, vaccines are to pharma to bring disease. They're trying to prevent a disease, but then they cause this whole array of of diseases and problems, because what they only measure for adverse reactions within only 28 days after the vaccine. That's it. They don't ever measure real long term. But going on that note, Doc, and I can't remember if I asked you this, and maybe I have, and I apologize if I have asked you this in the past, but would you say there is a safe vaccine? I know I get that question all the time, and I have my answer, but I just want to hear from you.
Well, it's a very easy answer to give, and that is that the measure of safety, the ability to make the claim that a vaccine is safe and effective, comes from the appropriate double-blind, randomized control clinical trial in the pre-licensing phase before it goes universally into children. That is when you compare unvaccinated children with vaccinated children. And those have never been done. Well, I take that back. They have never been done in the pre-licensing phase by those people who should have done them. So the safety studies were entirely substandard and cannot substantiate the claim that the vaccines are safe. So the answer to your question is no. And when you look at the 12 studies that are now available, that have recently been reviewed by Peter McCullough's team, you see that the outcomes in the unvaccinated are always superior in terms of health than the vaccinated. The vaccinated are systematically across the board less healthy than the unvaccinated. So there comes a time when we need action. And I'll give you, this is the conclusion. I'll just read this to you. I was invited to be on this paper, which was very kind. I contributed a little bit to it, but it was years ago, Ben, you'll remember, all I asked for with the Lancet paper was further science. Please do the science to determine whether vaccines cause autism or not. This is a paper on the determinants of autism. It reviews 136 studies that have looked at this issue or purport to look at this issue. And the conclusion is this, that combination and early timed routine childhood vaccination constitutes the most significant modifiable risk factor for autism spectrum disorder. In other words, it's preventable. Review of the science shows that vaccines are the most significant modifiable risk factor. And there it is. And so the science has been done. Why people do not wish to take notice of it is alarming to me. More and more people have and are, and many things have made a difference. People like yourself, films have made a huge difference. They've changed public opinion, and COVID has had a massive effect on global public opinion. People don't trust public health anymore, and public health wonders why. And they're now about to spend a fortune on promoting vaccines and trying to restore trust in public health. That will not happen. Believe me, that will not happen because you've lied.
Right.
You've lied. Let me again read one more thing, and this is really shaped my thinking over the years on this. This is from the Federal Register, which is a government document, Federal Register number 49, 107, 1984, and it's in relation to the polio vaccine. But this really summarizes the mentality of public health. This is from the head of the FDA at the time. And he's talking about the polio vaccine. Any possible doubts, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist.
Yes. I remember reading that, Doc. Can you
repeat
that one more time?
I will. This is staggering because this is what you and I have been up against all these years. This mentality. Any possible doubts, whether or not well-founded, about the safety of the vaccine cannot be allowed to exist in view of the need to assure that the vaccine will continue to be used to the maximum extent consistent with the nation's public health objectives. In other words, it doesn't matter how serious the adverse reaction is, how many children it affects or kills, it doesn't matter. It doesn't exist. It cannot be allowed to exist. That is totalitarianism. That is staggering.
People, listen to what he's saying. There doesn't matter. Death has occurred from this vaccine, massive injuries, and it doesn't matter. Silence and censor these crazy anti-vaxxers. We're a bunch of quacks. We're a bunch of loons, slanders in the media, and this is exactly what they are doing. Doc, I want to go back to the PCR. I was looking 5. So we have the new vaccine schedule. We're following the European. I want to get your intake on that. We have 17 diseases. We had 72 vaccines on the schedule, for 17 different diseases. Now we're down to 11 diseases, and there's still going to be probably 50 or 60 vaccines on the schedule here because we're following the European model. But 5 out of those 11 diseases, we still rely on the PCR test to diagnose, which I think people need to wake up on. We saw the measles, the mumps, the pertussis, rubella, and varicella are all utilize the PCR test. So it's very interesting. So what is your take on the new European model that we're following from 17 diseases down to 11?
Well, I think on the positive side, it reflects a really far more enlightened HHS under the guidance of Bobby Kennedy Jr. I think he's doing an enormously good job, and I think that people need to recognize. A lot of people wanted him there, and when he got there, they were frustrated by the apparent inaction. What one has to realize is that on both sides of the aisle in Congress, many people, Republican and Democrat, are funded for their campaigns by the pharmaceutical companies.
Mm-hmm. So
they are beholden in many ways to the money that's coming in from these companies. And so the pushback against Bobby Kennedy, particularly from those who aren't interested in the science, has been enormous. Despite that, he's made great strides. And this is very, very important because it begins to rationalize the vaccine schedule. It begins to alert people to the fact that the safety science isn't there. That's changed dramatically on the CDC's website now, acknowledging that this is
right.
Previous claims were not scientifically based, and the science hasn't been done and needs to be done, and he will do it. And moreover, that the vaccine schedule needs to change. I think one of the big problems, though, is one that remains is these polyvalent vaccines that have a constellation of measles, mumps, rubella, and chickenpox in them.
The cocktails.
This is a combination in which the immune system has never seen them in the past.
Yes.
Never, ever seen them, never encountered them, particularly in view of the fact that they're injected rather than being inhaled or caught cutaneously. And that's very, very alarming. And I asked David Salisbury at the Department of Health in the UK, who's in charge of the vaccine program. Years ago, I said to him, what did you do to compare the safety of the single vaccine versus the MMR? Surely you must have done that. If I gave you 3 antihypertensive, 3 blood pressure drugs at one time, it would kill you. It would kill all your patients that you put it on. You don't do that. Mm-hmm. This polypharmacy is fraught with hazard, and yet with viruses, live viruses, you're prepared to do that in a way that the immune system's never encountered them before. Mm. And he said, we had no reason to assume that giving the triple vaccine would be any more dangerous than giving the single. Well, you do not make assumptions on behalf of all the children potentially in the world to whom you plan to administer this vaccine in one way or another. You do not make any assumptions, because if you get it wrong, you get it wrong for a lot of people. And this is exactly what happened with the absence of safety studies prior to the widespread use of the COVID shot. You do not make assumptions. You do thorough studies to determine whether 3 is worse than 1. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it did alter the immune response, particularly to the mumps component. And then they add chickenpox into it. And when they do that, then they double the rate of seizures. There you are. You don't have to say any more.
Right.
3, 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 don't equal 3 or 4. They don't. They equal something completely different.
And it's really, this is where it's heartbreaking to me. It's just the fact that you're seeing so much vaccine injury, especially vaccine injury that's going off the radar that doctors aren't recognizing. We have the vaccine court system has paid out over $5 billion in vaccine injuries. I've gotten debates with people on this topic that, the VAERS, yes, VAERS is a terrible reporting system, but it's a felony to falsify a vaccine injury on that reporting system. and so, I have a lot of heartache in this topic because it is causing massive injuries. But going into the cocktails and the developing nervous system, we vaccinate through the skin, and you mentioned like injecting versus like ingesting or inhaling. I've always thought, and I've always argued, when they say that they vaccinate and it takes 2 weeks to develop so-called antibodies to that vaccine. I always say, well, what happens in that first 2 weeks? I mean, I believe that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. I don't feel like, the body is dumb. I mean, we have this innate intelligence inside the body that's telling our heart to beat, our lungs to breathe, our cells to communicate. We have trillions of cells, working together in this beautiful choir of physiology, and it's like, do you think the body is so dumb and deficient from these vaccines so that we need to, inject the body with this concoction, that we are inherently flawed, deficient, and weak without these vaccines? I just don't believe that to be true. And I always say that these babies are not born with a fully developed blood-brain barrier. And when we vaccinate these infants, that these ingredients will enter into the nervous system. And that's how they wreak havoc on the nervous system. And this is why we have more neurological developmental delays and disorders and demyelination. And I know your work is in the gut a lot with the GI and all this stuff, but can you weigh in on your opinion on the blood-brain barrier, the connection to this, and the connection of developing antibodies? And I know you mentioned the antibodies diminish after vaccination, but what are your thoughts on the blood-brain barrier?
I mean, firstly, one of the most important things you just talked about was the age of exposure. Things are not developed. Blood-brain barrier is not developed. The gut has not been colonized yet with the bacteria that are necessary to establish normal immune responses. A lot of things are in the process of happening. Children are, in other words, at their most vulnerable at that point. So is age of exposure to these things important? The answer is absolutely yes. This is where my work started, in measles virus, the natural measles virus, and age of exposure and the risk of inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis. And we reasoned that it wasn't just that you were exposed to measles, you were exposed to measles in an unusual way, perhaps at an unusual time when you are very young. We then went on with the Swedes to study this, and we showed that children born to mothers who themselves had measles during pregnancy, very, very rare, because the vast majority of people in Western countries have had measles, or at that time had measles when they were young. So we found pregnant mothers who'd suffered measles during pregnancy. There were 4 of them, and 3 of them gave birth to children who later on in life, at the age of 30, went on to develop severe Crohn's disease. The odds of that were millions and millions to 1. So was age of exposure important? It looked like it was. So years later, I went to meet with the CDC at Cold Spring Harbor when people were still talking to me. I'd been to testify before Congress and then went to Cold Spring Harbor to meet with the CDC, FDA, and others to talk about this. And they said, Dr. Wakefield, look, every child gets measles and only a few get autism. How do you explain that, if there's a link? I said, well, that's medicine. So a lot of people smoke, only some develop lung cancer. We don't know why. There are cofactors. But I believe that one of the cofactors is age of exposure. The younger you get the vaccine, the greater the risk. And the reason for putting that forward was our own observations, plus the fact that if you get measles under 1, you're more prone to a rare fatal encephalitis than if you get it over 1, which is the value of maternal breast milk antibody, for example.
We'll be right back after a word for our sponsor. Today's episode is sponsored by Ezra Healing, a place devoted to renewal and deep-rooted well-being. Ezra Healing supports individuals and families in soothing the nervous system, or releasing accumulated stress and trauma, and restoring the body's God-given ability to repair and thrive. Their method is gentle, discerning, and grounded in honoring how the body was created to function. With steady guidance, thoughtful education, and practical resources, they come alongside each person to foster safety, resilience, and whole person healing. If you're seeking a space to breathe, rebalance, and truly heal, Ezra Healing offers a powerful path forward. To learn more, visit them at www.ezrahealing.com. And now back to the show.
And so they said, okay, we're going to look at that. They went back to Atlanta and they did a study. And this study became the basis of the movie Vaxxed. Because what they did is they discovered that it was absolutely true that the younger children got the MMR vaccine, the greater the risk of autism, highly significant. They spent the next 14 years covering up that information, destroying the documents, destroying the source data, and putting millions of American children, and by proxy children around the world, at risk of serious permanent neurological damage. They didn't care. What they cared about was their control, the public perception of them, public confidence in their policy making, and their own reputations. That's what they cared about.
Goes back to the quote, must, no matter what, push the vaccine narrative forward.
That's it. Push it forward, whatever the cost. And so I found out about this through Brian Hooker years later. We made the film Vax. That there was and did they come back to us? People said, our critics said, well, there were a few of them said, you made it up. That's not true. Let me promise you this, that if we had made it up, if we'd made one word of a lie in that movie Vax that went all over the world, we would have been sued to the moon and back.
%.
Not a whisper, because they knew it was true.
It's 100%. That's it. William Thompson, I have a love-hate relationship. I'm thankful he came forward, but it's like he needs to get louder. I'm thankful he's working now with Bobby Kennedy, and he's, I pray that this truth gets out there. If you've never seen Vaxxed, I highly recommend you watch it. It's comical too, Doc, because I did a debate with all these pharma shills here a couple of years ago, and I brought up William Thompson, and they're like, his study, the real study that he presented was debunked. I'm saying, so let me get this straight. He admitted that the CDC is tailoring and doctoring studies to show desired outcomes, and you want to trust the study that the CDC came out and said, here's a study you need to trust. It's like, no, this needs to be investigated. We need to get William Thompson on trial under oath and have him, I don't know what the word is, subpoenaed or whatever we need to do to get this information out there. So it is that they are covering this up. And then you got the argument that autism is genetic, and I think that's what they want us to believe. And this is why I think they push, in vaccination in utero. They want these babies damaged before they even enter the world. So what are your thoughts?
That's with their narrative that it all starts in the womb because it's genetic. No, there was an outstanding presentation that before Ron Johnson's committee, I'm sure you saw it the other day, an outstanding presentation on the merits of the genetic argument, and it was just ripped apart. It was absolutely ripped apart. There was two people talking common sense, including Aaron Siri, and then there was a guy from California on the side of public health. And it was the worst day of his life. He was having a miserable time because he really knew nothing and cited a lot of literature that Aaron Siri just ripped apart. And the point that came out of one of the presentations was that the vast investment in the genetic research has produced virtually zero, nothing at all. And so it is environmental. We're rapidly coming to realize now that it's environmental. And certainly, as I quoted from the data from Nick Hulsher and Peter McCullough, the data now confirm that beyond all reasonable doubt, vaccines are involved.
That's it. It's, call for what it is. You have this agenda to really almost be, how do you say it? It's not politically correct to talk about autism because people they take it on as their identity. There's nothing wrong with my child that has autism. Autism is beautiful, and you're seeing that. It's like, well, no, we're talking about children that, they had a vast vocabulary. They were hitting milestones. They go in, they get this vaccine, and now they're they have this neurological injury. Now they're nonverbal. These kids are in diapers. They can't function without assistance daily. That's the autism we're talking about. Massive neurological damage here that are occurring from post-vaccination. That's the issue, and that's what we're talking about. That is not genetic. And then you got these idiots that are like, oh, that's anecdotal. I mean, there was a family in the movie Vax that had triplets. Okay, and they had, they got the vaccines that same day, and then boom, it's like that same day, all three kids, they had this injury, and it was like the porch light was on, but nobody was home. These kids were not responding, and it was post-vaccination, and it's not this is not a genetic thing. This is a brain injury that's occurring. So people need to understand that. And I think there is an agenda to try to convince the masses that it is genetic. But again, the literature is showing that. There's observational data that shows that this is a vaccine injury, like you said. So Doc, I want to know, going forward here, what would you like to see happen? What do you think is the main issue regarding just the stronghold that big pharma has on our healthcare system? If I put Dr. Wakefield at the head of the HHS right now, what would you do?
Well, there are two things, and there are the things that I would personally do and the things that I would advocate for or legislate for that should be done. I think, first of all, vaccination across the board has got to be entirely voluntary. It's got to be based on fully informed parental consent. And fully informed means a knowledge of all of the risks and all of the benefits, including the whole paper, for example, or including this quote from the Federal Register. Parents should be aware that is a policy that is at the highest level of government. So it's got to be based on fully informed consent. There can be no coercion, no lies, no dissembling. It must be based upon fully informed consent. And in the meantime, we need to do the studies. We don't need to do too many more, and the great majority have been done. We will never, for example, dissect out now whether it's aluminum or acetaminophen or vaccines per se or the whole schedule or thimerate. We won't, because it's too complicated. You could not design a study that dissected it out to reduce it down to this is due to this one thing, and I don't believe it is. I believe it's an amalgam of all of these things coming together, conspiring together to produce a highly toxic reaction in a developing immune and neurological system. And so we have to be practical about what we can achieve scientifically, but that doesn't mean that there cannot be policy changes. I think that I would certainly get rid of the multivalent vaccines. I would get rid of vaccines that I don't consider to be important, much as in the same way has been done, even though they're still available and they've just eliminated the recommendation. I think I would put an immediate stop to all mRNA-based vaccine programs, because my fear is that with the increasing failure of the live viral vaccines that have been around for decades, they are going to attempt to replace those with a measles mRNA vaccine, a mumps mRNA vaccine, etc. And that fills me with utter horror.
Oh, you and me both, my friend.
Now, the other thing I would do, and comes from me as a filmmaker, because films, and I've made 6 films now, they have had a profound effect on public perception. Mm-hmm. They've changed people's minds. In the clinic, Ben, you can reach one person at a time. You can talk to one family at a time. But if you make a movie, you can speak to millions. And that's made a big difference. That and COVID have had a profound impact on public perception of public health and vaccine safety. And so I would go on making films. That's what I do now. I would resign as the head of HHS, and I would continue making films, because I feel that with my understanding, my background, my experience over the last 30 years in this field allows me to tell stories in a particular way. And the one thing I want to talk about, and you alluded to it, in terms of those children who are already damaged, who've lost their speech and language, who are incontinent, who are in diapers as teenagers and adults. We mustn't forget those left on the battlefield. Indeed, we mustn't leave them on the battlefield of man's quest to conquer infectious disease. Things will change. Parents will become more informed. Vaccine policy is changing and will change further. And I do believe we're beyond the tipping point. But I have a concern, and this, before I die, I need to highlight this in the public eye, and that is to talk about the tragedy, make a movie about the tragedy of those millions of children already damaged who will not benefit from all of the things that we've done to put this right. That's the film I want to make now. So if you've got anyone out there, Ben, anyone listening to this show who would like to get involved in making that film, we'd love to hear from them. I don't want donors. I want people investing with the expectation of return, just like a standard movie. That's what this is to get out there and tell that story in a compelling way that highlights to people the extraordinary need that it already exists and how we must not leave these children, these individuals behind, because they have paid the price. They have been the wounded on the battlefield, and they've paid a huge price, in this crazy quest to annihilate infectious disease in human beings in the most cavalier and almost kindergarten way.
Yep. Doc, it's evil. In what we are doing, we are exposing evil. We're shining light on this industry, and that's the thing. This is where my conviction comes from. Your conviction. We're defending these families. We are a voice for the voiceless. I would love to help you in this film. I have thousands of messages from people have all the time telling me their stories. I would love to help contribute and be part of that film and help you get that film off the ground. I would love to help. I believe that life's not what you gather; it's what you scatter, and that's what it's all about. And so my heart is for those children, and I know films have been very, very influential. I tell everybody to go watch 1986 The Act. I feel like that is, how do you say it? Vax was very emotional. People aren't moved necessarily by logic; they're moved by emotion. So telling the story in these films, I think, is very powerful. Sharing testimonials. But then I have the people like, well, where are the facts? And that's where I bring in the 1986 The Act, because that film was loaded with facts, and it just tells the story so well. Well, Doc, I want to give you the last word here of encouragement, where people can find you, where people can watch your films and know more about what you're doing and keep up with you. Why don't you just put a plug in for that, Doc?
Very kind, Ben. Thank you. If you want to get in touch with us, we're at info@wakefieldmediagroup.com. info@wakefieldmediagroup.com. If you want to watch the movies, all 6 of them are available at wakefieldmediagroup.com. So please go there, the website. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much for your offer, Ben. I appreciate that very much. My message is really mainly to mothers, to parents. Trust your instincts. Maternal instinct, a knowledge of when the child is well or ill, is one of the most powerful gifts of really God. I suppose God's most powerful gift to mankind is this extraordinary ability of a mother to understand and nurture her child through the critical period of life. And I hear so many stories of mothers saying, I knew. That little voice inside me said, do not do this. And yet I was coerced, I was pushed, I was persuaded by the man or woman in the white coat to go ahead and get my child 14 vaccines on one day, and their life was never the same again. Our lives were never the same again. And I knew all along, and I've been beating myself up ever since. Trust in that instinct. The doctors would like to usurp that instinct and persuade you that they know better, but they don't. Mothers know better. So please trust that instinct, trust yourself. And that's been one of the most powerful guiding lights in my clinical career.
Doc, I value, the knowledge you bring to the table so much. And I have so much respect for you. You're one of those docs that really stood in the gap, and really, you've been unafraid to bend a knee to this. You've been persecuted and slandered in the media, but just know that there are lots of us that support you and respect the work that you're doing. And I consider you a brother from another mother. And I'm thankful to be sitting and standing in the foxhole with you. This is it's an uphill battle, but the tides are turning, the dam is breaking. It's an exciting time to be alive, and I just want to encourage you and encourage those that are listening. We never know how far reaching something we may think, say, or do today will affect the lives of millions tomorrow. So you don't have to have a podcast. You don't have to have a massive following on social media. You just have to maybe tell one person, and you can change the world. So never underestimate your voice and the power of just telling one person. So your voice matters. Dr. Wakefield, I really, really appreciate you, my friend. Thank you. Those that are listening, go support him. One more time, Dr. Wakefield, where can we find you? The website, Wakefield Media?
WakefieldMediaGroup.com, and info@WakefieldMediaGroup.com is the way you can get in touch with us.
Support him. Go share the films. Get out there. I have seen the films. They're phenomenal. They are very, 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 they can be very heavy, but it's the truth. When we know the truth, we carry a burden. But thankfully in Matthew, it says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." That's an encouragement from Scripture. God bless you, Dr. Wakefield, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Bye-bye.
To August of last year, nobody really knew who I was.
There's about 12 people who are producing 65% of anti-vaccine misinformation.
We need to come together as Americans and realize that we have a war at hand here. Right?
Like, dude, how scared of this shit do you have to be to be wearing gloves, a face shield, a mask at this point?
Help us to urge folks and say to them, look, it's time to roll up your sleeve and get the shot.
Chiropractor in Omaha, Nebraska, responsible for 65% of the anti-vaccine misinformation. Put what I say to the test. Just don't write me off as crazy misinformation.
Doctor, please bring yourself in order. 600,000 people will die of cancer. 300,000 people will die of obesity this year. When is enough enough?